I would like to start by acknowledging some people who have made it possible for me to receive this trusted award. Almost all of you will know that the person to whom I owe the most in bioethics and in life is my wife, Ruth Faden, sitting in the front row here between David and Dan. Ruth's intellectual talents are prodigious, as many of you know, and I've been the beneficiary of those talents for all these years, not to mention her personal devotion. Of all the people here in this room, I'm pretty sure that I've known Jim Childress longer than I have known anyone else because we were students at Yale University together. So thanks, Jim, for what is just now a couple of years shy of a 50-year relationship, and certainly one of the most meaningful that I've ever had. I'd also like to thank my friend and colleague, Patricia King, who's sitting in the back row, in case I make a mistake and she feels like she has to leave, of the Georgetown Law School, who many of you will know. In the early years, the really years prior to what Dan and Tom were talking about at the Hastings Center, it was Patricia who introduced me to the world of research ethics. I was working with the National Commission, I'll say something about a little bit later, and she was the person who taught me in the early years both about how the government works, about how national commissions work, and also about research ethics. Pat's wisdom and friendship over the years has been absolutely invaluable. And I know the Hastings Center feels similarly about these people because all three of them are long-term fellows of the Hastings Center. So lucky me and lucky Hastings Center. Now, two things stand out in my mind about bioethics in the early 1970s, beginning around 1974, the years people have already mentioned. The first was a set of lectures that Jim and I gave at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics together, which was done in a lecture debate format in what we call the intensive bioethics courses. And it was these lectures that led to the principles of biomedical ethics. Let's just say the book came right out of these lectures after a few years of rewriting. And the second thing that comes to my mind was a Hastings Center-sponsored 4-year research group in ethical theory and bioethics, which was assembled by Dan Callahan and Tris Engelhardt. Most of you will not have known because you're too young or you came to the Hastings Center or the Kennedy Institute later, but the intellectual stimulation in both of these institutions fostered the exhilarating sense that you were creating a new field, what Dan was referring to as the first generation of bioethics, and I think it really was. So because of people like Andre Helligers and Leroy Walters at the Institute and Sam Gorovitz, who was leading the way in philosophy, and Dan Callahan at Hastings, just as starters, I had the great luck to be introduced at the most elevated level of bioethics right from the start when I was barely out of graduate school. So to all these people, I owe a very great deal. Finally, I need to make one acknowledgement about the talk that I'm about to give. My interest in the subject dates back to the 1970s, as Frank Miller, sitting in the audience here, knows very, very well. But the true inspiration for this talk comes from, and in much of its substance as well, it comes from my wife Ruth and Nancy Cass at the Johns Hopkins University as a result of a grant on the relationship between research and practice. They're the principal investigators, Nancy and Ruth, and I'm a co-investigator along with Steve Goodman and Peter Pronovost and Sean Tunis. It's been very meaningful, and this talk undoubtedly reflects many of the ideas that have come out of our collaborative thinking. So wherever it's wrong, that would be me, but wherever it's really good, I would imagine it evolves from the group. All right, so my topic is the distinction between clinical research and medical practice, and what it might have meant and what it might come to mean in bioethics for public policy, and for that matter, I think, for private institutional policies. This distinction has dominated how we've conceptualized the areas of biomedicine in the last 4 decades. We've framed that world so that a biomedical enterprise is either in clinical medicine or it's in biomedical research. Put another way, the biomedical world is bifurcated into 2 separate domains: accepted practice and research. This distinction has given us purportedly distinctive domains of bioethics as well. There's medical ethics or clinical ethics, and there's research ethics. The same distinction also affects how we think about federal regulations. Roughly speaking, research is risky, it's unproven, it's not yet accepted as standard practice, and therefore it has to be regulated when it involves human subjects. By contrast, medical practice relies on interventions of proven benefit and acceptable risk, and it uses only approved and accepted therapies. Accordingly, medical practice needs no comparable regulation. If this cryptic map of the territory is correct, the research practice distinction is a mighty and a pervasive distinction. A great deal, I think, turns on it. Many people in this room know how bioethics came to embrace this bifurcation. But just to put us all on the same page, here's my thumbnail sketch of what happened. In the early to mid-1970s, as bioethics was cutting its baby teeth, the air was thick with discussion of research abuses, such as the Tuskegee syphilis case and assorted other cases. Beginning in the region of the Tuskegee Ad Hoc Advisory Panel Report, and roughly between the years 1973 and 1978, both in bioethics discourse and through the deliberations and conclusions of government commissions, we erected a fixed wall of separation between medical practice and medical research, and therefore between being merely a patient and being a patient who is a subject of research. DHEW, now HHS, cemented this separation into federal regulations. We were hugely concerned at the time that we had been under-protecting human subjects, especially those in vulnerable groups. Nothing comparable in the treatment of patients rose to anything like this level of concern. Much of this wall of separation was built piece by piece by the U.S. National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, the commission that I worked with, together with Pat King and together with Brad Gray, who I see over here on the right wing. So I'll have to be very honest in what I say about the commission, since both of them are here. A prominent objective of this commission's work was, and I quote its own statement, to distinguish between biomedical and behavioral research on the one hand and the practice of accepted therapy on the other hand, here comes the punchline, in order to know what activities ought to undergo review for the protection of human subjects of research. That's interesting because it shows from the outset the assumption was if you just nail down the difference between practice and research, then you will know what needs to be reviewed and what doesn't need to be reviewed. A federal law had mandated that the commission make this determination. The commission's recommendations on the matter can be bluntly stated. It's really pretty simple schema. To qualify as practice, that is, say, medical practice, two conditions must be satisfied. There must be an intervention aimed at benefiting a patient, that's one. The second is the intervention must have a reasonable prospect of success. The actual language is reasonable probability of success. Bear in mind, as we go along for the rest of this talk, what is said here, a reasonable probability of success, because I'll make a big deal of it. By contrast, to qualify as research, the two conditions that must be satisfied are a protocol control design to test a hypothesis, and secondly, an organized aim at what was called generalizable knowledge, generalizable scientific knowledge. This elegantly simple schema has had an enormous influence in both bioethics and regulatory policy, nationally and internationally, and it appears to me still today to be the received view in federal regulations and far beyond. Until something like right now, I think, we have had good reason to assume the correctness of this topography in bioethics and in federal regulations. But is it really warranted, or at least should we continue to accept it in the way in which we have? Let's suppose, for the time being, that just for a moment, that I've accurately described the boundaries between research and treatment currently found in bioethics publications and in federal regulations. Now I ask you to move away from that and to imagine for a few moments a possible world, notably different from this one. In this world, research and practice are seamlessly bonded together in all advanced healthcare institutions. Research is the way practice is conducted, and practice cannot be effectively delivered without a constant infusion of research data. In advanced healthcare institutions in this possible world, research drives patient care from diagnosis through treatment. The place everybody wants to be, if they're in need of medical care and can afford it, is what I will call a therapeutic research center. This is simply an institution that fully integrates research with practice on a daily, updated basis. Here, information is always up to date because it's constantly updated via networks of information incoming from therapeutic research centers around the world. The patients who take on the peak risks in this world are patients who are not at therapeutic research centers. The doctors who are most in need of regulation or need at least careful supervision. In this world, in order to protect patients, are physicians who are not immersed in this research-controlled environment. These physicians are constantly behind in treatment developments, and consequently, their patients are at increased risks. Is this possible world futuristic? Or is it something like that we're in the world that we're coming to at the present time? If I had to place my bets, I'd place my bet on the latter. Let's consider what happens, just as an example of our present world, at many cancer centers, where various activities surrounding research and practice do not fall, in my view, neatly into one of these two categories, research and practice. Phase 1 cancer trials have often been viewed as a paradigm of pure research, dealing with safety and toxicity rather than treatments. However, even Phase 1 cancer trials are commonly viewed by patients, by recommending physicians, and even by many investigators as a source of potentially life-saving medication or treatment, and sometimes as the only treatment available. Some patients receive a benefit even when given only a small dose, although, in conventional terms, the primary objective of the trial, usually having 20 to 80 people or so, is to establish safe dosage, side effects, bodily effects, and whether the cancer is affected biologically. Phase 1 dose escalation studies require clinical experience and judgment. They are not rigidly methodological. As the research progresses, subjects, usually in different cohorts, will be given a slightly higher dose, and then dosage is gradually escalated according to a projected schema of ascending dosing levels. Decisions are made along the way about whether, in the interest of subjects, the trial should be continued at all. A record is kept of the primary response of each subject. Dose escalation studies, in the ideal, progressively improve treatment modalities, subject to clinical experience and judgment all along the way. If some patients, even a small percentage of patient subjects, are helped in the course of trials, as some certainly are, it would be unreasonable to say that they are not being given a treatment, or perhaps, again, more cautiously stated, a potentially efficacious treatment. Likewise, it would be unreasonable to say that these patients are not subjects in a scientific study. They are both. The point of cancer trials is both to treat and to discover the need for more promising treatments and then to make the treatments better. Phases 2, 3, and 4 trials bring promising interventions increasingly closer to something like accepted treatments, or what I would prefer to call validated treatments. Phase 2 studies involving 100 to 300 patients or so sometimes indicate that the intervention tested is effective and constitutes a benefit, even though that's not the primary goal or even a major part of the design. Phase 3 testing, maybe using 1,000 to 3,000 patients, sets out to confirm effectiveness, monitor side effects, compare the new intervention against existing ones, and the like. However, an intervention will not ordinarily progress to phase 3 at all unless it is already shown in phases 1 and 2 promise as an effective treatment after those first runs of trials. Here, let's remember the National Commission's condition of a treatment. There must be a reasonable probability of success. What are we asking at the end of phase 1, phase 2 about progressing on to phase 3? If not, there's a reasonable probability of success. Phase 3 trials can only offer that reasonable probability, I think, but can not only offer that, but can establish which intervention is most effective and or which intervention is the easiest to tolerate. Trials in phase 3 may establish new standards of care. Finally, in phase 4 trials, they're conducted only on already validated treatment with the hope of improving them or perhaps removing them from the market. That's the system that we have. In my view, a cancer center is a research center, but it is also a treatment center. Suppose you have a child who is a candidate for a cancer trial. The most likely motivation, if you enroll your child, is that you want your child to be treated. In pediatric oncology, the trial is the treatment. Are you, as a patient or as a parent, under a therapeutic misconception? Maybe, but I don't think so necessarily. I would say that you are most likely placing a bet on a non-validated treatment that has a reasonable probability of success. According to an interestingly normative statement on the website fda.gov, which is, of course, an FDA website, and I quote from the website, a child, it's really normatively interesting, a child should not be deprived of a treatment in a clinical trial that is necessary for that child's health. No qualification on treatment here. The treatment here is later described as an experimental drug. So an experimental drug is a treatment in the course of such trials. I would say that some treatments, including some in which there is strong evidence that they are effective with some patients, do not yet meet a threshold of scientific validation. There is mounting evidence of effectiveness, and these interventions are the best treatments we have, despite non-validation, which is, of course, validation is simply cutting a threshold across a continuum of development so that it becomes a good drug or therapy. Regarding federal regulations, to say that the world of regulating oncology trials is not a world of regulating practice because we don't regulate clinical medicine makes no sense to me when the research is the treatment. A cancer center, as I said earlier, is a treatment center. Material found on clinicaltrials.gov, which is an NIH website, is equally interesting and I think supports these claims. Clinical trials are there repeatedly described as treatment trials that test experimental treatments. It is said that, and I quote, participants in clinical trials can play a more active role in their own health care, gain access to new research treatments before they are widely available, and help others by contributing to medical research. Note the language here of research treatments, which is used over and over again at this website. Throughout, the language of experimental treatments is likewise common. It is, I think, the exact functional equivalent of what I want to say about a non-validated treatment, though I won't go into why I prefer that language. Among the most interesting categories discussed at clinicaltrials.gov and at FDA is that of a treatment IND, which refers to a treatment investigational new drug, also called on the website a treatment protocol. FDA Gov alternates between the language of treatment and potential treatment. It comes in and out. So is it a treatment or is it a potential treatment? I actually think they're the same thing on this website. This gets quite interesting at times. The NIH website says, and I quote, the primary intent, this is really interesting because it's got the world almost inverted here. The primary intent of the treatment IND protocol is to provide for access to the new drug for people with a life-threatening or serious disease for which there is no good alternative treatment. That's the primary intent. A secondary purpose, it says, this is a direct quote too, a secondary purpose for a treatment IND protocol is to generate additional information about the drug, especially its safety. So what's your primary intent? Treatment. What's your secondary intent? Research. Although such a treatment is non-validated, a so-called expanded access protocol cannot be undertaken, according to this website, can be undertaken only if clinical investigators are, this is a direct quote, only if clinical investigators are actively studying the experimental treatment in well-controlled studies or all studies have been completed. There must be evidence that the drug may be an effective treatment in patients like those to be treated under the protocol. This, to me, is an unmistakable attribution of treatment, and it satisfies the National Commission's condition of a reasonable probability of success, in which case it cannot merely be research. Just one caution at this point, as I move on now, about what I've been saying, and now I want to say something further about. I've several times mentioned federal regulations. I do not, however, intend my comments to be confined to regulations. Rather, I mean them to be attached to many forms of the oversight of practices. Such oversight can come in the form of systems of supervision, management, or administration that do not involve any form of regulation. The relevant moral questions, which is the one that I'm primarily interested in, I'm sure the Hastings Center would be primarily interested in, may or may not be connected to law and regulation, may have nothing to do with them. The basic inquiry is about the forms of oversight and management that are morally appropriate in the case, I think, of both clinical ethics and research ethics. I began this talk with the 1970s. At that time, a distinction was widely invoked between therapeutic research and non-therapeutic research. By 1980 or so, this distinction was under severe critique on grounds that the notion of therapeutic research makes no sense. It's like saying practice research, which is a meaningless notion. The National Commission found the notion of therapeutic research obfuscatory and morally dangerous because it allowed research having only one or two therapeutic components, but otherwise was not therapeutic, to be classified as therapeutic and clinical, and therefore to be justified in the way ordinary treatments are justified. Beginning in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, sorry, the idea of therapeutic research was abandoned in federal guidelines, and eventually in most international codes, though it was hanging around for many years. Biomedical research was conceptualized, or perhaps reconceptualized, as scientific and as non-therapeutic. Nonetheless, Alex Capron, who gave last year's Beecher lecture as the recipient of the award, pointed out a quarter of a century ago in the Hastings Center journal IRB, this was in January of 1982, that the term therapeutic research actually does make good sense if it's defined as follows, and I'm quoting Capron's definition. It is research to evaluate practices or procedures that are intended to provide, or that have some reasonable possibility of providing, therapeutic, diagnostic, or preventive health benefits to the subjects. The critical part at the end is very important. So understood, therapeutic research brings therapy and research together and focuses them on the individual patient subjects involved in the research. The more research shows promise of the benefit for them, the more labeled therapeutic research makes sense. And the more research is remote from a therapeutic prospect of benefit, the less warrant there is for the label of therapeutic. So the strategy that I'm envisaging is, in effect, a continuum model between the two polar extremes of wholly non-therapeutic research and therapeutic research, where therapeutic research simply means that research and practice are so intimately bonded that the one cannot proceed without the other. To accept such a continuum is to hold that it is not always appropriate to distinguish sharply between research and practice. But this conviction is also not to assert that we can never sharply distinguish between them. This continuum conception allows for pure cases on each pole, both the therapeutic and the non-therapeutic. Now, what's the relevance for bioethics? This is my set of conclusions. First, consider the different ways in which clinical ethics and research ethics are institutionally scrutinized. Several practices and institutions have been built up around the distinction between practice and research, and these may now need adjustment in upcoming years. I think they almost certainly will. One is the IRB system, perhaps even as far back as 1967 or so, the central pillar of research ethics. Should we decrease the scope of the ethical review of protocols and practices that we now have? And by way of contrast, do we need more in the way of scrutiny through formal review of procedures and practices in clinical medicine? What should happen if, as I've projected, research becomes intimately bonded to the provision of treatment? A related question is whether our current systems of review are so restrictive that they wind up causing more problems than they actually alleviate. At the origins of our current system of review, we were exclusively concerned that we underprotect human subjects. Today, we may need to focus on the possibility that we overprotect them. Not infrequently, potential subjects of research are more interested in being included in research than they are about its risks. We need to investigate whether we've created a nightmare of formal review that causes critical delays in research, unnecessary costs in the system, additional risk to research subjects, the unavailability of critical information, and inadequate attention to needs for treatment I&D protocols. In contrast, it may be that our system of non-review of clinical medicine, where we have no similar apparatus, is under-demanding to the point that we allow too much risk of harm to patients to go unreviewed and unsupervised, and then to find its way into the system. This may be a legacy today of our lack of concern in the 1970s that we were underprotecting patients, because the entire focus was on subjects. Underprotection of patients may occur through loose systems of mostly after-the-fact monitoring, if there's any monitoring at all, thereby leading to misdiagnoses, misreading of slides, improper treatment recommendations, and negligent treatment. Related matters of patient care that may need more careful review or supervision in clinical medicine include review of conflict of interest in making recommendations, improper charges to patients or insurance companies, improper structures of financial incentives for physician employees, improperly structured codes of conduct in institutions, and the like. Finally, there's one almost overridingly important moral lesson to be learned from the 40-year history that I've mentioned. Let's stop using distinctions like research practice and research treatment as if they somehow had the raw power to determine morally which forms of investigation and which forms of practice must be supervised. Our current system has been created on roughly this assumption, but it is, I'm convinced, a quite flawed assumption. The moral appropriateness of forms of oversight ought never to be determined by whether they simply by the fact that they fall in the domain of research or they fall in the domain of treatment. Bioethics will, I think, gain a new freedom in its objectives of the protection of patients and the improvement of healthcare systems by moving away from the bifurcated world, even if we created it. Thank you very much.